The night was supposed to be quiet. The moon hung low over the Italian hills, its pale light stretching across the Roman camp like a silver shroud. But then, a tremor. Another. The ground itself began to hum. Marcus, a 20-year-old Roman soldier with calloused hands and a scar on his cheek, froze mid-sentence while sharpening his gladius. The sound grew low, rolling thunder that didn't belong to the sky. From beyond the dark tree-line came a strange, almost otherworldly trumpet blast, deep and haunting. The horses neighed in panic. "Gods, what is that?" whispered Flavius beside him. Marcus couldn't answer. His stomach knotted. The night exploded. Trees cracked like splintering bones as massive shadows burst from the forest. At first Marcus thought they were monsters from some old myth. Tusks gleaming, towering shapes covered in armor. Then the firelight caught them, elephants. Carthaginian war elephants. Their eyes blazing with torchlight, stormed into the Roman camp. The smell of burning pitch filled the air as flaming bales were hurled overhead. Tents ignited, turning the night into a hellish dawn. Soldiers screamed, some trampled under the feet of the beasts. Others skewered on long spears as Carthaginian cavalry thundered in behind the elephants. Marcus saw a friend, young Gaius, reach for his shield only to vanish under an elephant's massive foot. The crack of bones was louder than the battle cries. Marcus wanted to run, but the world seemed to slow. Sparks rained down around him, and every sound became painfully clear. The trumpeting elephants, the clatter of swords, the desperate prayers of dying men. Somewhere in the chaos, a Carthaginian officer shouted in a foreign tongue. The words were harsh, but the meaning was clear. No mercy. Marcus stumbled through smoke and fire, heart hammering. He thought of his home, the vineyard outside Rome. His father's voice warning him that Carthage was no ordinary enemy. Now he understood. A spear whistled past his ear. He ducked, rolled, and slammed into a fallen tent pole. His lungs burned from smoke. He forced himself to his feet and glimpsed the impossible. A Roman standard, the proud eagle, falling into the mud as a war elephant crushed its bearer. Above the din, a single thought screamed in his mind. We are not fighting men. We are fighting gods. But this wasn't just one battle. It was the start of something far greater. Far away, beyond those burning hills, another figure watched his plans unfold. On a distant ridge, Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian commander whose name Roman mothers used to scare their children, sat astride his horse. The firelight flickered across his weathered face, revealing a thin smile. He remembered his childhood in Carthage. The salty wind of the harbor, the clamor of merchants, and his father's stern eyes. Hamilcar Barca had once knelt beside a small boy, placed a tiny dagger in his hand, and made him swear, never be a friend to Rome. Hate them for what they did to us. That oath burned hotter in Hannibal's chest than the flames now devouring the Roman camp. The Roman Republic, arrogant and hungry, had underestimated Carthage for too long. They thought their legions were invincible, their homeland safe behind the Alps. Hannibal would teach them fear, fear carried on the backs of elephants. Yet even Hannibal, brilliant as he was, could not see how far this war would go. He could not know that the struggle he'd begun would last nearly 2 decades, cost hundreds of thousands of lives, and decide the future of the Mediterranean world. For Marcus, for Rome, and for every soldier now choking on smoke and blood, the night's horror was only the beginning. As dawn crept over the carnage, Marcus stood among the smoldering ruins, gripping his sword with trembling hands. Around him lay broken shields and broken men. Somewhere in the distance, Carthaginian horns called their warriors back into the hills. Marcus whispered, half to himself, half to the gods. If this is just the start, what comes next? The answer would shake the ancient world to its core. But the real enemy was yet to come. Long before the elephants stormed that Roman camp, a boy in distant Carthage stood on a balcony overlooking a restless sea. The salty breeze tugged at his dark hair as warships rocked in the harbor below. The boy's name was Hannibal Barca, and even at 9 years old, his eyes carried a fire that seemed far older than his years. His father, Hamilcar Barca, was a hardened general who had tasted bitter defeat. Carthage had once ruled the western Mediterranean. Rich, powerful, feared. But Rome had humiliated them in the First Punic War. They had stripped Carthage of its fleets, its silver mines, and its pride. Hamilcar never forgave them. That evening, under a blood-red sunset, Hamilcar knelt beside his son. He drew a dagger from his belt and held it between them, its edge catching the dying light. "Swear to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Swear you will hate Rome. Swear you will never be their friend." Hannibal felt the weight of his father's gaze. The boy's small fingers closed over the dagger's hilt. The blade was cold against his skin. "I swear," he whispered. The wind howled through the harbor, as if the gods themselves had heard the oath. Years later, that boy grew into a man of cunning and charisma. Hannibal wasn't just a warrior. He was a master of deception, a leader who could inspire loyalty even in the harshest conditions. His soldiers followed him not out of fear but because they believed in him. Carthage's leaders, weary of Roman arrogance, entrusted him with their armies in Spain. It was there, on the banks of the Tagus River, that Hannibal began shaping his legend. He trained his men relentlessly, teaching them to fight in forests, rivers, and mountains. He studied Rome, its strengths, its weaknesses, its pride. And he waited. The chance came when Rome meddled in a Carthaginian ally's affairs, violating a fragile treaty. Hannibal didn't hesitate. He marched on the city of Saguntum, Rome's friend, and besieged it. The siege was brutal, a message to the world. Carthage would no longer bow. When Saguntum fell, Rome declared war. But Hannibal wasn't going to wait for their legions to come to him. He would take the fight to them in a way no one thought possible. Late one autumn, Hannibal stood at the foot of the Alps, staring up at the jagged peaks that pierced the clouds. Snow already crowned the summits, and icy winds whipped at his cloak. His officers urged him to turn back. The mountains were deadly even without an army. With tens of thousands of soldiers, pack animals, and elephants, it was madness. But Hannibal's eyes burned with the same fire they had the night he swore his oath. "Rome thinks the Alps will protect them," he said quietly. "Let's prove them wrong." The crossing was a nightmare. Bitter winds flayed exposed skin. Snow blinded the men. Paths crumbled beneath their feet, sending pack animals screaming into the abyss. At night, the temperature plummeted so low that men woke to find frost on their eyelashes and their comrades frozen stiff beside them. Elephants, unused to the cold, trumpeted in distress as their handlers coaxed them forward. More than a few slipped and fell, their massive bodies tumbling down icy slopes. Each loss was a wound to Hannibal's army, but still he pressed on. On the fifth day, a rockslide tore through the column, burying dozens. Hannibal climbed onto a boulder, his cloak whipping in the wind, and shouted over the storm. "Look!" He pointed to a distant valley where, through a break in the clouds, the green plains of Italy stretched under the winter sun. "There is Rome's heartland. One more push, and their world will tremble." The men roared, their fear momentarily forgotten. When Hannibal's army finally descended into Italy, frostbitten and battered, they were fewer, but every survivor was hardened by the ordeal. They had done what Rome thought impossible: crossed the Alps in winter with an army and elephants. News of his arrival spread like wildfire. Roman senators scoffed at first, but whispers soon turned to dread. Mothers pulled their children closer. Farmers abandoned fields near the northern frontiers. In Rome's great forum, one voice trembled over the murmuring crowd. Hannibal is in Italy. And though no one could say it aloud, a terrible question lingered in every Roman's heart. If he could cross the Alps, what else could he do? But Rome had not yet seen the true face of Hannibal's genius, or the nightmare he was about to unleash at Cannae. The summer sun beat down on the Italian plain, turning dust into choking clouds as two massive armies faced each other. Marcus, the young Roman soldier who had survived the night of fire and elephants, stood among 80,000 legionaries, the largest force Rome had ever assembled. Their crimson cloaks rippled like a sea of blood. Across the field, Hannibal's army looked smaller, a patchwork of Africans, Spaniards, Gauls, and the few surviving elephants. To the Roman senators who had marched out to watch the glory, it seemed obvious. This would be Rome's revenge. But Marcus couldn't shake the unease curling in his stomach. Hannibal's troops didn't look afraid. They looked eager. The Carthaginian general rode along his line, his dark eyes scanning the horizon. He had studied Rome for years, and today, at Cannae, he would deliver the blow that could break the Republic forever. The Roman horns bellowed. The ground trembled with the advance of legion after legion, shields clashing, swords raised. Dust rose like a storm cloud, swallowing the sun. First, it seemed Hannibal's line buckled. The Carthaginian center retreated slowly, step by step, drawing the Romans in. Marcus felt a surge of hope as his cohort pressed forward, shouting victory cries. But something about the retreat seemed too clean, too deliberate. Suddenly, horns blared on both flanks. Hannibal's hidden cavalry swept in from behind like wolves closing on a wounded stag. The retreating center curved into a deadly crescent. In moments, the Romans were encircled. What followed was slaughter. The press of bodies became suffocating. Men couldn't swing their swords, couldn't even lift their arms. Marcus was crushed between shields, the stink of sweat and blood filling his nose. Panic rippled through the ranks. "Hold the line!" an officer screamed, just before a spear burst through his chest. Carthaginian horsemen crashed into the rear. The Romans had no room to maneuver. They were trapped in a tightening ring of death. Blades flashed in the haze. Screams turned hoarse, then silent. Marcus felt someone's blood splash hot across his face. The ground beneath his feet grew slick with gore. The sun climbed higher and still the killing went on. Hours passed. The battlefield became a charnel house. By nightfall, nearly 50,000 Romans lay dead. Consuls, senators, farmers, veterans, all gone. Marcus stumbled out of the carnage, numb and hollow. The plain was a graveyard. He looked to the horizon and saw Hannibal's standards waving proudly in the twilight. In Rome, the news struck like a thunderbolt. Messengers galloped through the forum, their faces pale with horror. Senators tore their robes in despair. The wails of mothers echoed through the narrow streets. Temples overflowed with citizens begging the gods for mercy. Some whispered that the Republic was finished, that Hannibal would march on Rome itself and burn it to ashes. Allies deserted, and even loyal cities questioned their allegiance. The mighty Rome that had once scoffed at Carthage now trembled like a cornered animal. But Hannibal did not march on the city. Perhaps he lacked the siege equipment. Perhaps he wanted to break Rome's spirit through fear, not fire. Whatever the reason, his choice gave Rome something it desperately needed: time. Marcus returned to the city with haunted eyes. He walked past funeral pyres that burned day and night, their smoke hanging over Rome like a dark omen. He had buried friends, seen officers hacked to pieces, and felt the shadow of annihilation. One night, as he sat outside a silent temple, he overheard two senators whispering, "Cannae was the end." "No," the other replied, though his voice trembled. "If Rome falls, the world falls with it." Marcus looked up at the stars. They seemed dimmer now, as if even the heavens doubted Rome's survival. He wondered if the gods had abandoned them, or if they were testing the Republic's resolve. Yet amid the despair, something unyielding stirred. The Senate refused to negotiate with Hannibal. No surrender, no terms. Rome would not beg. They banned public mourning to prevent panic. Boys barely of age were conscripted. Old men volunteered to pick up spears. Somewhere among the chaos, a new commander began to rise. One who had watched Rome's humiliation and vowed to change its fate. The Republic had been brought to its knees, but it was not dead yet. And the man who would lead its resurrection was already preparing for war. The ashes of Cannae still haunted Rome. Funerals burned for weeks, their smoke staining the skies. The Republic's pride was shattered, but not its will. Somewhere in the aftermath, a young man watched the flames with fierce, unblinking eyes. Publius Cornelius Scipio. He was barely in his 20s, yet he had already seen the face of despair. As a boy, he had stood on a battlefield beside his father, staring at Hannibal's war elephants, his heart pounding with fear and awe. Now, as Rome's hopes seemed to wither, Scipio made a silent promise. He would not let Hannibal's shadow destroy his people. Scipio wasn't like the older, cautious senators. He was bold, charismatic, and unafraid to take risks. While others debated endlessly in the forum, he gathered a small force and rode to Spain, Hannibal's lifeline. If he could cut off Carthage's resources there, maybe Rome could breathe again. In Spain, Scipio proved himself more than just a noble's son. He studied Hannibal's methods, the ambushes, the feigned retreats, the psychological warfare, and turned them against Carthage's commanders. At the siege of New Carthage, he struck swiftly, using the tides to breach the city's defenses. His victory was so daring that soldiers began calling him the New Alexander. Letters from the front reached Rome like rays of sunlight through storm clouds. The name Scipio whispered through taverns and temples. Perhaps this man could save us. Marcus, the weary soldier who had crawled out of Cannae's nightmare, found himself under Scipio's command. The young general's speeches lit fires in the hearts of even the most broken men. "Rome does not yield," Scipio told them one dawn, his voice carrying over the clang of weapons. We endure, we learn, and we strike where they least expect. Marcus felt the old pride stirring in his chest. For the first time since Cannae, hope felt real. Meanwhile, Hannibal, still undefeated in Italy, felt the weight of years pressing on him. He had crossed mountains, shattered legions, and haunted Rome's dreams. But supplies were dwindling, allies were faltering, and Carthage's leaders hesitated to send reinforcements. He stood on a ridge overlooking the Italian countryside he had ravaged for over a decade. The fields stretched green and golden under the sun, deceptively peaceful. Hannibal's mind returned to that childhood oath by the dagger. He had promised to destroy Rome, but even the greatest general could not fight time, hunger, and politics forever. Scipio's victories in Spain sent ripples through the Mediterranean. Carthage, alarmed, recalled its commanders. Scipio pressed his advantage, driving Carthage back step by step. Then came his boldest proposal yet: take the war to Africa itself. It was madness, the Senate whispered. Invade Carthage's homeland? Risk everything on foreign soil? But Scipio's confidence was infectious. Fight him here and we die slowly, he argued. Fight him there, and we end this war. Marcus watched as even the most cautious senators fell silent before Scipio's burning conviction. The plan was approved. The Roman fleet set sail under a blood-red sunrise, its sails snapping in the wind. The men aboard whispered prayers to Neptune, their hands tightening on their shields. Marcus leaned on the rail, staring at the horizon where Africa waited. The sea smelled of salt and destiny. When they landed on Carthaginian soil, the desert wind whipped sand into their faces. Scipio's troops clashed with Carthaginian forces, winning swift victories that shook Carthage's pride. Desperate, the Carthaginian council sent a message across the sea. Recall Hannibal. Far away in Italy, Hannibal received the summons. He looked once more at the land he had stalked for 15 years, then mounted his horse without a word. His journey home would set the stage for the final confrontation. As Scipio prepared his legions for the decisive battle, Marcus polished his sword beneath a starlit sky. He remembered the faces of the dead at Cannae, the terror of elephants, the humiliation of defeat. Now, on the enemy's soil, he felt a strange calm. The tide had turned. Somewhere across the dunes, Hannibal marched toward them. Still dangerous, still brilliant, but no longer invincible. The desert wind howled through the camp as if whispering a prophecy. Two legends would meet, and only one empire would rise from the ashes. The African sun rose like a burning coin over the plains of Zama, painting the horizon in fire. Marcus tightened the straps on his battered armor, the metal warm already though dawn had barely broken. Around him, thousands of Roman soldiers stood in tense silence. Far across the field, banners of Carthage fluttered in the dry wind. Elephants lined up like living siege engines, their tusks capped with iron. In the distance, a lone rider approached the Roman line under a white flag. It was Hannibal himself, now older, the fire in his eyes tempered by years of war. He met Scipio in the no-man's land between armies. Two legends faced each other. One who had almost crushed Rome, and one who had risen from Rome's ashes. Dust swirled around their horses as if the earth itself held its breath. Hannibal Barca, Scipio said, his voice calm but edged with steel. You've learned well, Hannibal replied. Better than your fathers before you. His gaze drifted to the Roman ranks. This could end without more blood. Scipio's jaw tightened. You had your chance to spare blood at Cannae. Rome does not forgive. This ends today. The two men locked eyes for a long, heavy moment, then wheeled their horses and galloped back to their lines. The Carthaginian horns blared. The elephants surged forward, massive and unstoppable, dust clouds boiling around their feet. Their trumpeting cries drowned out the pounding of Roman drums. Marcus felt the ground tremble beneath him and gripped his spear so tightly his knuckles went white. Hold! An officer shouted. The first elephant thundered into range. Trumpets screamed. Arrows darkened the sky. Roman skirmishers hurled flaming javelins, and horns sounded sharp commands. Then, as if on cue, the Roman lines opened. Gaps formed like jaws. Trumpeting and confused, the elephants barreled through, finding themselves flanked and harried from all sides. Marcus ducked as one of the beasts crashed past, its rider toppling with a strangled cry. Dust and screams filled the air, the smell of sweat, blood, and burning pitch mixing into something primal. Then came the infantry. Carthaginian spearmen advanced, shields locking, their sandals crunching over sun-baked earth. The clash of steel was deafening. Swords rang, shields splintered, and the battlefield became a whirl of chaos. Marcus fought like a man possessed. Each swing of his gladius was a memory. Gaius crushed under an elephant's foot, the fallen eagle of his legion, the weeping mothers of Rome. Around him, men screamed, some in victory, others in death. The African sun burned overhead, unblinking and merciless. On the far side of the field, Scipio watched the lines shift. He had studied Hannibal's tactics for years, and now he used them against him. He feigned retreats, lured Carthaginian forces into overextending, then struck where they were weakest. Carthaginian cavalry broke under the Roman countercharge. Dust clouds rose like storms as horsemen scattered. Marcus glimpsed Hannibal in the distance, his cloak whipping in the wind, riding along his crumbling line, urging his men to hold. But the fire that had once terrified Rome was flickering. As the sun reached its zenith, Scipio gave the final order. Fresh Roman reserves, hidden until now, surged forward in a thunderous advance. The Carthaginian line buckled, then shattered. Marcus pushed through the melee, his sword arm aching, his mouth dry as sand. Ahead of him he saw Hannibal dismount. The great general stood alone for a heartbeat, surrounded by chaos. He looked not angry, but tired, like a man who had seen too many suns rise over too many battlefields. Their eyes met across the carnage. Marcus felt an unexpected pang. Not of hatred, but of awe. This was the man who had once seemed unstoppable, the shadow that had haunted Rome's dreams. Hannibal raised his chin, nodded once, as if acknowledging the turning of history, and then vanished into the fleeing ranks. By dusk, the plain of Zama was silent except for the groans of the dying and the buzz of flies over bodies. Carthage's banners lay trampled in the dust. Scipio rode among his men, his expression grim despite their cheers. Victory had been bought in blood, but it was victory nonetheless. Rome's destiny was secured. Marcus sank to his knees, staring at the horizon where the sun bled into the earth. For years he had fought in fear. Now he fought in memory of the fallen, and for the world Rome would build. But even in defeat, Hannibal's ghost would linger. History would never forget the man who almost broke an empire. The battlefield of Zama was silent now, except for the cawing of distant crows. Smoke curled lazily into the sky as Roman soldiers gathered the spoils of victory. Carthaginian shields lay shattered, their proud horsehair crests trampled into the African dust. Scipio Africanus stood on a low ridge, staring at the horizon where Hannibal had vanished. The two men had met earlier that day, after the slaughter ended. Hannibal, aged and weary, approached Scipio under a white flag. "You have defeated me," he said quietly, his voice low but dignified. "But you have also defeated an idea, that Carthage could rule without Rome's shadow." Scipio nodded, offering respect to the man who had nearly brought Rome to its knees. They spoke like warriors who understood each other's burdens. Then Hannibal turned, mounted his horse, and rode away. He would never again command an army against Rome. News of Carthage's defeat spread like wildfire across the Mediterranean. Rome's citizens poured into the forum, cheering until their voices cracked. They hailed Scipio as Africanus, the conqueror of Africa. But beneath the celebration, a darker current stirred. Rome had tasted supremacy, and it would never be satisfied again. In Carthage, the streets were silent. Families wept for lost sons. Traders stared at empty warehouses, knowing their city's power had been broken. Hannibal returned to a hero's welcome, but he felt none of the joy. He knew Carthage would live on borrowed time now. He warned the council to reform, to strengthen their politics and defenses, but many ignored him. The seeds of Rome's future vengeance, the Third Punic War, were already planted. Scipio, meanwhile, struggled with the cost of victory. He walked among the Roman wounded, men missing arms, blinded by spears, or whispering final prayers. "This is the price of empire," he murmured to his friend Laelius. The victory had saved Rome, but it had also hardened it. The republic that had once fought only for survival would now fight for domination. And yet, in that moment, the world had changed forever. Carthage, once the queen of Mediterranean trade, had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. Rome would go on to conquer Greece, Egypt, and lands even farther away, building an empire that would last centuries. The clash between Hannibal and Scipio was more than just a war. It was a turning point in history. Imagine the young Roman boy, decades later, walking through the ruins of Carthage with his father. The boy picks up a fragment of a broken Carthaginian shield, its paint faded by time. His father tells him of the war, of the man who crossed the Alps with elephants, of the hero who outsmarted him at Zama. The boy doesn't fully understand yet, but he feels the weight of history in his hands. Rome's destiny was not just to conquer, it was to be remembered. And somewhere, perhaps on a quiet evening far from politics and battles, Scipio Africanus might have thought of Hannibal. Two men, born enemies, who had pushed each other to greatness. Without Hannibal's daring, Scipio might never have become the general Rome needed. Without Scipio's brilliance, Hannibal's legend might have ruled the Mediterranean. The Punic Wars were over for now, but their echo would shape every empire that followed. The world had been watching when Rome and Carthage collided, and history itself had shifted. As the sun set on the smoldering fields of Zama, one truth burned brighter than the fires of war. Some battles do not end when the swords are sheathed. They live on, shaping the future in ways no one can yet imagine.